Have you ever wondered how one moment can turn everything upside down? What if I told you that a single punch, just a simple, seemingly meaningless act, could unravel a world of reveal, hidden truths, and change lives forever? Imagine this, a woman who's been wronged, but instead of fighting back with force, she does something far more powerful. She stands still and with a single glance, she challenges everything. The system, the people, the power structures, they all freeze. She doesn't need to shout or even speak. Before we dive into the full story, take a second and share with us, where are you listening from right now? And what time is it? Trust me, by the end of this, you'll be questioning the way you see the world. So stick with us as we take you on a journey that will reveal not just the ugliness of power, but the quiet force that can dismantle it. Ready, let's begin. Ready, let. Ryan Turner, years old, a white police officer, had always believed himself to be above the law. With a badge on his chest and a gun strapped into his side, he walked through the world with the kind of arrogance only authority could foster. The world was his to command. He had been trained to believe that the badge was more than just an emblem of duty. It was his ticket to power, respect, and control. Ryan reveled in it. His every move was calculated. Every decision was measured by the instinct that with this uniform, no one could challenge him. He had risen through the ranks of the Riverside Police Department, driven by a simple, unshakable belief that the badge made him untouchable. He was not just a cop, he was the law. In his mind, the people around him were nothing more than pawns in a game he controlled, and he was the king. From the streets he patrolled to the people he interacted with, everything fell into place according to his will. But it wasn't just the badge and the gun that defined Ryan Turner. It was the look in his eyes, the cold, unfeeling gaze that told you everything you needed to know about the man. He was confident to the point of being dismissive. And power wasn't just something he wielded, it was something he flaunted. He walked with a swagger that matched his attitude. Sure that his position in the world was unassailable. In his world, everyone else existed to serve his needs or to be subdued by the force he wielded. Ryan's arrogance wasn't just about his role as a police officer. It extended to every corner of his life. He wasn't just the law on duty. He was a man who believed that nothing could touch him outside the job either. His interactions with his colleagues were peppered with sarcasm, his mannerisms often mocking the very idea of humility. Ryan had a strong sense of entitlement, one that made him believe he could make others do his bidding simply by his presence. Whether in the station, on the streets, or in the bar, he commanded attention, and it came naturally to him. He believed his badge was not just a symbol of the law, it was a mark of his own invincibility. But beneath this self-assured exterior, there was a fragility, one he refused to acknowledge. Ryan was terrified of being challenged, terrified of being exposed as someone who, despite all his power and bravado, was just as human as anyone else. That fear was buried deep, cloaked in his arrogance, but it manifested in his interactions with others. He had a need to dominate, to ensure that no one could stand above him, that no one could defy him. His sense of power was reinforced by the authority the badge granted him. It was a security blanket, one he wrapped himself in every day as he patrolled the streets. Ryan didn't just wear the uniform, he embodied it. He prided himself on the control he had over the people he interacted with. In his mind, the people of Riverside City were there for him to oversee, to monitor, to control. They were all just parts of a greater mechanism that he was in his own eyes the undisputed leader of. And yet, despite all his outward confidence, there were cracks in his worldview, small, almost imperceptible moments where Ryan's hold on his reality slipped. He had the power, yes, but he also had the fear of losing it. He was always on edge, always calculating, always wondering if today would be the day that someone would see through him, see the insecurity lurking behind his arrogance. That fear would eventually lead to his downfall. For Ryan Turner, the streets were a kingdom, and he was its king. But even kings can fall. The first crack in his perfect facade would come soon enough. And it would come not from someone stronger than him, but from someone who refused to play by his rules. Someone who had the power to make him question everything he thought he knew. Someone who didn't need a badge to command respect. Someone who wouldn't be intimidated by his arrogance. But at this point, Ryan hadn't met that person yet. For now, he was comfortable in his belief that he could control everything and everyone around him. As long as he had his badge, his gun, and his arrogance, the world was his. He had yet to understand that real power didn't come from the uniform or the weapon. It came from the ability to recognize your own vulnerabilities and not let them define you. That lesson would come soon, though, and it would change him forever. Whoa. In the meantime, Ryan continued on his path, confident, dismissive, and unaware of the storm that was brewing just around the corner. He believed in the power of his uniform, but he would soon learn that the true strength of a person lies in what they cannot control. And the moment that Brianna entered his life, his control would begin to slip away. Brianna Cole, 25 years old, was a woman who blended seamlessly into her surroundings. She had no need for attention, no desire to stand out. Her quiet presence, her unassuming demeanor, and her calm, deliberate movements all contributed to the image of a woman who could easily be overlooked. But beneath the surface of this ordinary woman lay something far more extraordinary. Brianna wasn't just a woman living her life in the shadows. She was a CIA agent trained to survive in ways few could comprehend, let alone witness. And she had a secret power, one that if revealed would leave everyone around her in awe and fear. Most people who crossed paths with Brianna would never have guessed her true identity. She walked the streets of Riverside as though she were just another young woman, perhaps a teacher, a student, or someone trying to make her way in the world. She wore simple clothes, a pair of jeans, a light jacket, flat shoes, but the subtle confidence in her step told a different story. There was something about her, something that made you pause for just a moment longer than usual before continuing on with your day. But it wasn't her clothes or her quiet demeanor that made her stand out. It was the way she carried herself, as though she had seen and endured things most people could never imagine, yet was still standing tall and broken. Brianna had been trained in ways no normal person could fathom. Her training was not just physical, it was mental, emotional, and psychological. She had been taught to read people, to understand their fears, desires, and weaknesses with a glance. She could disarm a person with a word, a gesture, or even a pause in conversation. But it wasn't just her mind that set her apart. There was something far more extraordinary about her abilities. Brianna had powers that, if unleashed, could change the course of history. Powers that were as subtle as they were devastating. She was not just any agent. She was one of the best trained in a covert program that had turned her into a living weapon. But despite all her training, she never sought to use her abilities for destruction. Brianna's goal was always to preserve life, to stop those who would use their power to harm others. What made Brianna truly dangerous wasn't her ability to fight or her capacity to kill. It was the fact that she could walk into a room and make every person there question everything they believed about themselves. It was a power of presence, a quiet yet unshakable influence that took root in the hearts and minds of those who encountered her. Brianna didn't have to raise her voice. She didn't need to make threats. She didn't need to fight. All she needed to do was be still, to stand in the moment, and the world would shift around her. Her silence was her weapon, and it was more powerful than anything the world had ever known. Brianna had seen it all. She had been to war zones, political hotbeds, and covert operations that would never see the light of day. She had faced danger head-on, but unlike most agents, she didn't fear it. She simply embraced it, walking into the most perilous situations with the same calm resolve that she carried through every aspect of her life. Her courage wasn't loud or brash. It was quiet, unyielding, and steady. She didn't need to boast about her accomplishments because her presence alone made people take notice. They felt her power without her having to say a word. What Brianna didn't realize at the time was that her power wasn't just a gift. It was a burden. It made her a target. There were those who would stop at nothing to destroy her, to silence her, and to keep her hidden away from the world. But Brianna didn't run. She didn't hide. Instead, she faced everything that came her way with unflinching resolve. The idea of revenge or retaliation never crossed her mind. Brianna didn't need to make anyone suffer to prove a point. She didn't need to get even, because in the end, she knew that true power didn't come from striking back. It came from the ability to stay calm and watch the world around you unravel. And that was what made her a threat to those like Ryan Turner people. Like him, believed that power was something to be wielded, something to be used to control others. They believed that fear and domination were the ultimate weapons. But Brianna's presence shattered that illusion. She didn't need a gun, a badge, or a reputation to make someone tremble. All she needed was her ability to be still, to observe, and to make others face themselves. It was a power they couldn't control, a power they didn't understand, and that was what terrified them. Brianna was no ordinary woman. She was a force to be reckoned with, and she knew that her true strength didn't lie in physical prowess or brute force. It lay in her ability to make others see the truth, The truth about themselves, about their actions, and about the world they lived in. Brianna didn't need to play by the rules that others set. She didn't need to conform to their expectations or definitions of power. She was a law unto herself, and that was what made her the most dangerous person in the room. And now, as her paths crossed with Ryan Turner's, the stage was set for a confrontation that neither of them could have predicted. Brianna's calm, steady gaze would soon be tested against Ryan's arrogance, and neither of them would walk away unchanged. Brianna didn't need to raise her voice to make her presence known. All she had to do was stand there, and the world would take notice. The game was about to change, and Ryan Turner had no idea what he was up against. But Brianna, with all her quiet power, was ready to show him. The question was, would he be able to handle it, or would his arrogance finally be shattered by the one person who had the ability to make him face himself? Only time would tell. It was a blistering afternoon in Riverside, the kind of day where the sun beat down relentlessly, turning the streets into shimmering ribbons of heat. Ryan Turner, the 27-year-old officer, was in his patrol car cruising down the quiet neighborhood streets. He had just finished a routine traffic stop, one of many that he believed were beneath him, but necessary for maintaining his so-called authority. The sound of the radio buzzed softly in the background, a dull white noise that did little to distract him from his thoughts. He'd done it again. He'd asserted his power, made the citizens of Riverside tremble under the shadow of his badge. That was his job, wasn't it? He was the enforcer, the protector, the one who decided who mattered and who didn't. But today the encounter he was about to have would shake the very foundation of his self-constructed empire. As Ryan drove, he spotted Brianna Cole crossing the street, her calm, purposeful steps matching the rhythm of the city. From the moment his eyes landed on her, something shifted in him. It wasn't just the fact that she was a black woman in a city that wasn't known for its racial harmony. It was deeper than that. It was a feeling, a spark of hatred, a primal urge to assert control, to make sure that people like her knew their place. Ryan, in his arrogance, saw himself as the rightful authority in Riverside. The badge on his chest gave him power, or so he believed. The gun on his hip was a symbol of fear, a weapon that commanded respect, or at least that's what he thought. Brianna's presence, her calm demeanor. Everything about her felt like a challenge to his idea of control. It wasn't anything she had done. It was just the way she walked, the way she carried herself. She didn't flinch at the sight of his patrol car. She didn't bow her head or look away. She just existed. For a moment, Ryan watched her, his foot instinctively pressing down on the accelerator, the engine purring as if it were a beast hungry for action. He pulled over, parking his car at an angle to block her path. The siren flared to life, a sharp, demanding wail that sliced through the air, making the world stop. People nearby turned their heads, their eyes flicking nervously between the scene and their own business. Ryan got out of the car, striding towards Brianna with a sense of superiority that oozed from every step. His eyes scanned her from head to toe, scrutinizing her every move as though he were judging whether she was worthy of his attention. Brianna didn't flinch. She didn't move. She simply stood there, her gaze calm, unwavering. There was no fear in her eyes, no anxiety in her stance. She didn't play the game Ryan expected. She didn't show the deference that others typically did when faced with his badge. This unnerved him. His anger began to rise slowly at first, like a boil starting to heat up, until it exploded in a burst of violence. Without a word, Ryan stepped closer, his body language hostile, his hand hovering over the holster of his Glock 22. He stopped just a few inches in front of her, his chest puffed out, his jaw clenched. His voice was low but dripping with contempt. "You're hiding something, aren't you?" he sneered. "Something that doesn't belong here." Brianna didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her eyes locked onto his, steady, unblinking. It was as though she was seeing right through him, into the deep, twisted parts of his soul that he tried so desperately to keep hidden. It was a gaze that carried weight, one that made even the most hardened of men second-guess themselves. But not Ryan. Ryan, used to asserting dominance, couldn't allow himself to feel threatened by a woman, let alone a black woman. His mind was clouded by his racial bias, his inflated sense of power, and his need to prove to himself and to her that he was in control. His fist clenched, and without warning, he threw a punch. The blow landed squarely on Brianna's face, a harsh crack that echoed down the quiet street. Time seemed to slow for a moment as the sound of the impact reverberated in Ryan's mind. Brianna's head snapped back, her long hair flying loose from its tie. Blood trickled down her lip, staining the pavement beneath her feet. The crowd, who had been standing idly by watching the exchange, gasped in shock. But Brianna didn't fall. She didn't even step back. She remained standing, unmoved. Ryan froze. For the first time, doubt crept into his mind. The crowd around him grew restless, their phones rising in unison to record the scene. A young woman screamed, her voice high-pitched with disbelief. "What the hell are you doing?" she cried out. Ryan barked back, his voice laced with panic. "This is a security stop. She's not cooperating." But no one believed him. There were no weapons. There was no defiance. All they saw was blood. Blood staining the pavement, and a woman who refused to be knocked down. The stillness that followed was far more terrifying than any struggle, any fight. It was as if Brianna were a symbol of something larger, something that Ryan couldn't fully understand. Brianna, still calm, raised her fingers to her lips, dabbing the blood with a deliberate slowness. She didn't speak. She didn't shout. She simply stared at Ryan, the intensity of her gaze like a mirror, forcing him to confront something deep within himself. And for a brief moment, Ryan felt it something like a primal fear, something he had never known before. It wasn't fear of being caught. It wasn't fear of consequence. It was the fear of being exposed, of being seen. Brianna's presence was too much for him to handle. It was as though she had peeled back the layers of his armor, exposing the insecurity and fragility that he had spent his entire life concealing. In that moment, Ryan understood he had struck something he couldn't control. The power he thought he wielded had no effect on Brianna. She was beyond his reach, beyond his understanding. As the backup arrived, a female officer approached Brianna, her hand gently touching her shoulder and guiding her away from the crowd. There were no handcuffs, no force. Brianna walked past the group of shocked onlookers, her head held high, her gaze still unwavering. The crowd parted to make way for her, none daring to touch her, none daring to challenge her. Ryan, rooted to the spot, watched her go, his fists clenched at his sides, unsure whether he felt rage, fear, or something far worse, shame. His mind reeled, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The punch had been meant to assert his dominance, to remind everyone around him who was in charge. But Brianna had shown him something he could never have anticipated. True power didn't lie in force. It didn't lie in violence or fear. It lay in something far more elusive, something far more dangerous. Ryan remained there for a long moment, the weight of the situation sinking in. The sun continued to beat down the world around him, moving on indifferent to his confusion. But for Ryan Turner, everything had changed. He had just punched a woman who refused to be intimidated, a woman who didn't need to fight back to win. And in that moment, he knew he had made the biggest mistake of his life. But what came next? What would Brianna do? And what would Ryan do now that the truth of his own vulnerability had been laid bare? The tension in the air was thick with uncertainty, and neither Ryan nor Brianna knew that their fates were now forever intertwined in a story that would challenge the very foundations of power, identity, and justice. The punch hit Brianna hard, sending her staggering, back, her body jerking as though it might crumple. But she didn't fall. The blood dripped from her lips, staining her dark skin, and her hair, disheveled now from the violent impact, tumbled from its tie, cascading around her shoulders. To anyone watching, it was clear she had just been assaulted by a police officer, a white officer in broad daylight, and for no other reason than his unprovoked fury. Yet Brianna did not break. She did not collapse onto the pavement. She stood tall, unwavering. Ryan Turner stood frozen, his fist still clenched, his breath shallow. He had expected her to fall. He had expected her to cower, to beg for mercy. That's how it always worked in his mind. That's how it always worked with the people he had dealt with. But not her. Brianna didn't even flinch. Instead, her gaze locked onto his, unrelenting, unmoving. There was no hate in her eyes. There was no fear, no anger. Her expression was calm, even serene. But beneath the calm exterior, there was something far more potent. It was a quiet, seething intensity that spoke volumes without uttering a single word. Brianna's eyes didn't accuse him. They didn't demand justice or retaliation. They simply watched him with the kind of depth that made Ryan feel like he was sinking into a dark abyss. It wasn't the violence of her response that shook him. It wasn't the blood on the pavement. It was her presence. The stillness of her power, the understanding that she had nothing to prove. She didn't need to fight. She didn't need to speak. The world around them seemed to pause in that moment. Ryan, despite the confidence that had always been his armor, felt the knot in his stomach tighten. He had never been confronted by someone like this. Someone who didn't respond to his violence, his authority, his badge. Brianna stood there, her posture unbroken, her eyes still locked with his. And in that silence, Ryan felt the weight of his own actions crashing down on him. For the first time in his life, he was the one who felt vulnerable. He was the one who felt small. His pulse raced as a sudden, uneasy shiver ran down his spine. What had he done? Why wasn't she responding the way everyone else did? Why hadn't she fallen to the ground in defeat like all the others? Brianna's silence spoke louder than any words could. She was not afraid. She was not submitting. And somehow that was more terrifying than anything he had ever encountered. Ryan took a step back, his hands still hovering near his holster, but for the first time he wasn't sure of what to do. His instincts, those that had always guided him through situations like this, betrayed him. He had expected to dominate, to intimidate, to reinforce the hierarchy he had grown so accustomed to. But Brianna's gaze was like a mirror, and for the first time Ryan saw himself for what he truly was, a man who used force to make up for his own deep insecurities. Brianna didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Her silence was deafening, her presence undeniable. She raised her hand gently, wiping the blood from the corner of her mouth, and then, as if she had made her point, she simply stood still. She wasn't waiting for permission to move. She wasn't asking for his approval. She was just there. And in that stillness, something inside Ryan began to unravel. The crowd that had gathered around them, curious onlookers. Some recording the encounter on their phones began to murmur. Some were in shock. Some were angry. Some were afraid, but no one dared move. No one dared intervene. Not because they feared Ryan, but because they knew deep down that Brianna wasn't the one who needed to be stopped. It was him. Ryan's mind raced, trying to find something to cling to, some justification for what had just happened. But there was nothing. Nothing but that gaze, nothing but the reality that he had just crossed a line he couldn't uncross. He had struck her, but it was as though she had struck him in return, striking him in a way that left him feeling exposed, vulnerable. It was as though she had peeled away the layers of his ego, showing him who he really was, a man who thought he could control everything, even people like Brianna. But she wasn't something to be controlled. She wasn't something to be intimidated. In that moment, Ryan realized that he had made a terrible mistake. And not just any mistake, a mistake that would reverberate far beyond the streets of Riverside. Brianna's presence was a challenge he could never have anticipated. Her silence wasn't weakness. It was strength. And in that strength, she had already won. The backup arrived a few moments later, a female officer stepping forward to approach Brianna. But Brianna didn't flinch. She didn't resist. She simply let the officer place a gentle hand on her shoulder and guide her away from the scene. No handcuffs, no force. She walked away with her head held high, her expression still calm, unbroken. She didn't need to say anything. She didn't need to do anything. Her very existence, her refusal to bow to Ryan's power, spoke louder than any words ever could. Ryan watched her as she walked past him, her figure fading into the distance, swallowed by the crowd. And in that moment, as he stood there frozen, the realization hit him like a freight train. He wasn't the one with the power. He wasn't the one who controlled the situation. Brianna had taken the power without ever lifting a finger. She had turned the tables on him simply by standing still. And that was something Ryan could never undo. The crowd began to disperse, their whispers dying down as they returned to their own lives. But the weight of what had just transpired lingered in the air, thick and suffocating. For Ryan, everything had changed in the span of a single glance, a single moment. And as he stood there, helpless in the face of it, he understood the most terrifying truth of all. There were some forces in the world that no badge, no gun, no amount of authority could ever control. Brianna Cole was one of them. Ryan remained in place for what seemed like an eternity, his mind reeling, trying to come to terms with what had just happened. The sound of his car door slamming shut was the only thing that broke his daze. He climbed into his patrol car, his hands trembling as he started the engine. But even as the car rumbled to life, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted irreparably. Something inside him had broken, and he didn't know how to put it back together. As he drove away from the scene, the streets of Riverside no longer felt like they belonged to him. The weight of the day's events, the punch, the silence, the gaze hung over him like a shadow. Brianna had left him with more than just a bruise on his ego. She had left him with a question he couldn't answer. What happens when the power you rely on is no longer enough? In the moments following the assault, Brianna did not say a word. She didn't scream. She didn't fight back. She simply stood there, her blood staining the pavement, her eyes locked onto Ryan's with an intensity that spoke volumes, and in that quiet, the entire world around her began to shift. It wasn't her actions that ignited the fire. It was the silence, the sheer force of her presence. A woman beaten in broad daylight by a police officer, and yet standing tall, refusing to be broken. The crowd that had gathered around them, the bystanders who had witnessed the momentary explosion of violence, stood frozen in place. Some fumbled for their phones, trying to capture the injustice unfolding before them. Their eyes were wide, not just from the shock of the punch, but from the eerie stillness that followed. Brianna's calmness, her unyielding gaze made them realize something far more sinister was at play. They were not just witnessing an isolated act of police brutality, they were witnessing the embodiment of systemic oppression, a deep-rooted injustice that they had, all in one way or another, accepted as normal. Phones were raised, cameras clicking, capturing every second of the scene. The footage spread like wildfire. It was shared across social media, appearing on news sites, being shared in groups and communities. Within minutes, what had been a simple interaction on the streets of Riverside had gone viral. And in that moment, Brianna's silence became a loud declaration, one that reverberated far beyond the street she stood on. It was a challenge to the very fabric of the society they all lived in. What Ryan had done was not just an isolated act of aggression, it was a reflection of something much larger, something that had been festering beneath the surface for years. People began to recognize that what they had witnessed wasn't just a police officer striking a woman. It was the manifestation of a much deeper issue, the abuse of power, the racial inequality that plagued their city, their country. It was no longer just Brianna and Ryan. It was the system, the structure that allowed such actions to happen without fear of consequence. As the footage circulated, the reactions came pouring in. Comments flooded social media. People spoke out, sharing their own stories of police misconduct, of racial profiling, of moments when they too had felt the sting of injustice. They had seen it in their own lives, in the lives of their families and friends, but had always remained silent. Brianna's gaze, her unspoken challenge, made them question that silence. It made them see that they had been complicit by standing idly by, and now they had no choice but to speak up. Some of the comments were filled with rage, others with sorrow, but all of them shared a common thread, the realization that something had to change. Brianna, in that single moment, had awakened something within them. She had forced them to confront the truth that they had all been avoiding, the truth that the system in its current state was broken beyond repair. The media, of course, picked up the story. News outlets ran footage of the incident showing the punch, the blood, the moment of tension. But they also showed Brianna standing strong, unbroken. Her defiance became the symbol of resistance, a symbol of all those who had been crushed under the weight of inequality for so long. The hashtags exploded, #justice, for Brianna, and racism, silence speaks, and the world began to take notice. Across Riverside and beyond, people took to the streets. Protests erupted, calling for justice, not just for Brianna, but for every person who had ever been subjected to police violence, to systemic oppression. There were marches, sit-ins, and gatherings, all fueled by the same message: enough was enough. The silence that Brianna had embodied had ignited a fire within the community, a fire that would not be easily extinguished. Even those who had once turned a blind eye to such issues found themselves questioning their own complacency. They had seen it happen on their own streets, in their own city, and now they couldn't look away. Brianna had forced them to confront the uncomfortable truth that they had ignored for too long. No longer could they pretend that the system was fair, that the playing field was level. They had to acknowledge the disparities, the biases, and the injustices that ran deep. The protests grew larger, and soon the issue of police brutality became a central topic in local, state, and even national discussions. Activists, leaders, and organizations rallied together, united by a common cause. The demand for accountability was deafening. Brianna's name, once known only to a few, became synonymous with the fight for justice. Her silent resistance had given the people a voice they had been denied for far too long. Ryan, however, remained in the background. He had become a symbol too, but not the kind of symbol he had imagined. He wasn't the hero, he wasn't the authority, he wasn't the protector. In the wake of his actions, he had become the face of everything wrong with the system, of everything that needed to be dismantled. And as the calls for justice grew louder, Ryan's world began to collapse around him. The department, under intense scrutiny, began to distance itself from him. He was suspended indefinitely while an internal investigation was launched. But even the investigation felt hollow. The people weren't asking for an internal review. They weren't asking for a slap on the wrist. They were demanding real change. They were demanding accountability, not just for Ryan, but for the entire system that allowed men like him to wield such unchecked power. And as the weeks passed, the public outcry only grew. Brianna, in her quiet way, had done what so many had failed to do. She had forced people to confront the truth, and in doing so, she had started a movement that could not be silenced, no matter how much they tried to suppress it. The system was shaking, and it wasn't just the people who were watching who noticed. Ryan could feel it too. The weight of the community's gaze was unbearable. Everywhere he went, he felt the eyes on him, the stares of judgment, of anger, of disappointment. He had expected to be the one in control, the one who held power. But now he was nothing more than a symbol of the oppression that the community was fighting to escape. As the protests raged on the issue of police reform took center stage, local lawmakers were pressured into action. New policies were proposed. And for the first time in a long time, it seemed as though real change might be on the horizon. The people had spoken, and their voices could no longer be ignored. But it was Brianna's quiet strength that had started it all. Her gaze had shattered the illusion of power. Her silence had spoken louder than any protest, louder than any march. She had forced them to see what they had refused to acknowledge for so long. The true power of the people was not in their anger or their noise. It was in their ability to stand still, to resist, without ever having to strike back. The world had changed, and Brianna, without saying a single word, had made it happen. The world Ryan had once known was shifting under his feet, and the ground was no longer solid beneath him. What had seemed like a routine day of enforcement was now haunting him. Replaying in his mind with every passing second, Brianna's face, her bloodied lip, her unyielding stare. It all echoed in the depths of his mind, forcing him to confront something far beyond his own actions. As the days passed, Ryan's sense of control began to slip away, unraveling piece by piece like a fraying rope. The power he once took for granted had evaporated, replaced by an unsettling void that seemed to grow larger by the day. The video footage from that fateful afternoon in Riverside had spread like wildfire. It was everywhere, on news outlets, on social media platforms, in the comment sections of articles, in private conversations. Brianna's stillness, her unspoken defiance, had become a symbol. The moment she stood unwavering, despite the violence she had just endured, had struck a chord that no one could ignore. The world had seen her not as a victim, but as someone with an undeniable presence, someone who refused to be defined by the system that had wronged her. Ryan, however, saw none of this initially. His ego, inflated by years of wearing a badge and carrying a gun, had been completely blinded to the deeper significance of what had occurred. He had thought he could control the situation, exerting his will over Brianna with a single blow. But what he didn't understand then was that Brianna's strength didn't lie in her physicality, her ability to strike back, or even her refusal to react. Her power was in her silence, in her stillness. And it was that power that began to crack open the system that had long supported Ryan's sense of invincibility. As the protests grew louder and social media exploded with rage, Ryan became an emblem of the issue, the very face of systemic injustice. It was no longer about him being a police officer who had struck a woman. It was about everything that he represented, a system that allowed his behavior to go unchecked, a system that had enabled him to act with such brazen authority. Brianna, with just one look, had revealed the fragility of that system, and now the world was watching, demanding accountability. The fallout was immediate. Within days, Ryan was subjected to the kind of public scrutiny he had never experienced. Comments flooded every platform he had once used confidently. His social media pages were filled with thousands of messages, not from people praising him, but from those condemning him, reminding him of his actions. Strangers, people he had never met, were telling him that what he had done was wrong, that the very foundation of his power was built on the fear and submission of others. It wasn't just the public who began to turn against him. Inside the department, the whispers grew louder. Colleagues who had once been his friends now avoided him, their eyes averted, their words carefully chosen. The same officers who had once laughed at his jokes, praised his tactics, and celebrated his victories in the field were now distant, uncomfortable in his presence. They didn't want to look at him, didn't want to be associated with him, and Ryan could feel it. It was a cold, suffocating feeling, one that wrapped itself tightly around his chest and made it hard to breathe. He had been the center of attention for so long, always in control, always respected. But now he was the pariah, the one who had become the embodiment of everything wrong with the system. The internal investigation that had been launched felt more like a formality than a genuine attempt at accountability. Ryan was suspended from active duty, but the damage had already been done. His name, his reputation had been tarnished, and it was too late to undo it. The investigation would eventually end in a slap on the wrist, a suspension, a reassignment, perhaps a forced apology, But the stain of his actions would never wash away. He was now the symbol of the very thing the community was fighting against. He had been caught on camera, he had been seen, and now there was no escaping the truth. But it wasn't just his career that was crumbling. It was his identity. The system that had once defined him, that had given him power and control, was no longer his ally. Ryan had always believed in the righteousness of his position, in the idea that he was above the law, that he could do whatever he wanted, because he had the badge, the gun, and the authority to back it up. But now he was being forced to see that the very system he had once relied on was no longer working in his favor. It was shifting, crumbling, being held accountable by the very people he had once overlooked. Marginalized and oppressed, he tried to deny it, tried to convince himself that it was all just a temporary storm. He told himself that once the protest died down, once the media moved on to the next scandal, everything would go back to normal. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. Something had changed, something fundamental, and it had all started with Brianna's gaze. She had given the world a glimpse of the truth, and now there was no turning back. As the days passed, Ryan grew more and more isolated. His calls went unanswered. His attempts to make contact with his colleagues were met with cold indifference. People who had once respected him now whispered behind his back, sharing their disbelief and their anger. They had seen what he had done and they couldn't ignore it. Even his own family began to distance themselves. His mother, who had once supported every decision he made, now struggled to look him in the eye. His friends, those who had once toasted to his successes, now avoided him altogether. Ryan's attempts to reclaim some semblance of control were futile. He tried to push back against the narrative, tried to explain his actions, tried to tell the world that he was simply doing his job, but no one wanted to hear it. His words were empty now, just another attempt to justify what could never be justified. His reputation had been shattered, and there was nothing he could do to rebuild it. The world had already made up its mind. And as the protests continued, as the calls for justice grew louder, Ryan's world became smaller. He could no longer walk the streets without feeling the weight of every eye on him. He could no longer hold his head high without hearing the whispers that followed him, the judgment that was silently passed on him at every turn. He had been the one in control, the one who had walked through life with a sense of superiority. But now he was the one being controlled, the one who had to answer for his actions. The power he had once wielded with such ease was now nothing more than a memory. And in its place was a growing realization that he had been a pawn in a much larger game. A game that he had never truly understood until now. Brianna had made him see it. Her gaze, her silence had shattered the illusion of power that he had clung to for so long. And now Ryan Turner was forced to face the truth. The system he had once relied on had failed him, just as it had failed countless others before him. The question now wasn't whether Ryan would be held accountable. It was whether he could ever come to terms with the fact that he had been part of something so broken, something so deeply flawed. Brianna had made him see the cracks, and now those cracks were beginning to consume him. Ryan Turner, a police officer who once saw himself as the center of the universe, now feels as though he is being pushed into a dark world where no one remembers his name and no one acknowledges his presence. That day, the moment when Brianna stood firm after the punch, her eyes neither angry nor fearful, but simply the gaze of someone who does not need to fight to prove her right to exist, changed everything. He could not understand why things had turned out this way. People seemed to have stopped wanting to look at him. Conversations in the police station became short, and there were no welcoming words or gestures. This was happening everywhere, from the coffee shop he used to visit every morning to the familiar halls of the police station where he once was a part of the team. The distant glances, the silent head shakes, the shrugged shoulders, as if no one wanted to care. All clearly signaled one thing: society had abandoned him. Before, Ryan thought he could control everything. The badge, the gun, the power he held in his hands, all of these were things he believed would command respect and fear. But now he realized that those things were just superficial, and all of it was far more fragile than he had ever imagined. The punch he delivered to Brianna wasn't the end, but the beginning of a series of events that he could no longer control. That feeling, the feeling of being left behind, forgotten, in a world where he once believed he was at the top, made him feel like an outsider. Each day, Ryan woke up with a sense of emptiness, and as time passed, he became more numb, unsure of what to do. He tried calling old friends, colleagues who had once been his greatest sources of support in life, but now they no longer answered him. His calls became meaningless sounds drowned in silence. Never before had Ryan felt so alone. He had once thought that loneliness was something that could never touch him. He was a cop, he had power, and so he believed that the world would always need him. But now when he looked in the mirror, he no longer recognized himself. The scars on his face were not the only thing he saw, but the deep cracks in his heart, where the respect, power, and values he once believed in had completely vanished. Brianna, the woman he had struck, had now become a stark contrast to him. She didn't need to do anything more to change this world. Just one look, one moment of silence, one act of non-resistance from her had turned everything upside down. And Ryan? He couldn't change anything. He felt like someone walking through a dream where all he could do was watch his life pass by without any control over it. Rumors about him continued to spread through the community, while some parts of society condemned him. His colleagues turned their backs on him. And within his family, the distancing became even more apparent. His mother, who had always stood by him, was no longer ready to support him. Ryan couldn't understand why everything had changed so quickly, but the only thing he knew was that nothing was the same anymore. He felt like a stranger in his own life. Brianna never uttered a word. She didn't need to speak, and because of that, she had won. With just a glance, she made an entire system face itself, confront the injustice and racism it had nurtured for years. Meanwhile, Ryan, who had once been part of that system, no longer recognized himself. Criticisms of him flooded social media platforms. Strangers, people he had never met, were now speaking out and condemning him. They didn't care about the reasons he gave. They didn't listen to his explanations. They only saw him as a symbol of injustice. He was a part of a system that had remained silent for far too long, a system that had allowed actions like his to exist without punishment. The worst part for Ryan wasn't the criticism. It was the silence. The people around him no longer cared. He had become invisible, cast out of society's narrative, forgotten. Every step, every sigh, it felt as though everyone looked at him with unfamiliar eyes. He was no longer the respected cop, but the one who was shunned and rejected. And then in a moment, Ryan suddenly realized that there was nothing worse than being forgotten. The loneliness in this silence, the loss of everything he once believed in, forced him to face himself. He realized that it was him and no one else who was the cause of everything that was happening. That feeling was uncomfortable. It was like a shell that couldn't be discarded, a painful truth that he couldn't change. There was nothing left to fight for. The social system that Ryan had once prided himself on being a part of had now turned its back on him. He could no longer escape his own shadow. Everything had ended, and it was in the silence and the forgetting that Ryan finally realized that sometimes silence is the most terrible punishment of all. After everything that had happened, Brianna had no intention of seeking revenge. She didn't spend a second being angry, nor did she have the desire to make Ryan suffer for what he had caused. She simply left the city without notice, without a goodbye. And in her absence, she left a wound in the community that could never heal. She didn't need to do anything to change everything. The community she had lived in, where Ryan had once confidently displayed his power, now found itself perplexed by Brianna's silence. No one understood why she had left, why she hadn't fought back, why she hadn't called for justice. She didn't need to speak. She didn't need to confront anyone. Her silence sent a stronger message than any words or actions ever could. When Brianna disappeared from the city, everything started changing in ways no one could explain. The community slowly realized that she didn't need to act to make things different. Her silence, her absence on its own, made everyone face what they had done, the silences they had once taken for granted. The community wasn't just witnessing the departure of an individual, but the end of a way of life, a system that had existed far too long without confronting the truth. People began to ask themselves questions they had never dared ask before. Why didn't Brianna need to say anything? Why did her silence have such great power? The answer was that Brianna's silence made them realize that what they had done, what they had witnessed, was wrong. The community could no longer pretend they hadn't seen it, no longer continue to play the role of the indifferent, and all of this happened simply because Brianna didn't need to speak a single word. Her absence also forced people to look at themselves. Those who had once stood by Ryan, those who had ignored his actions, now began to feel a silent guilt. Those who had once defended racism, defended injustice in society, now found themselves unable to justify their own actions. The averted gazes, the hasty apologies, all appeared shortly after Brianna's departure. She didn't need to return and face anyone. She didn't need to say that she was in pain or that she needed justice. Her absence spoke for everything. A silence so powerful that no one could avoid thinking about her. No one could avoid feeling guilty. Brianna understood that sometimes doing nothing is the most powerful action of all, and that's what made her so special. When Brianna left, no one could understand what she felt. She wasn't sad, she wasn't angry, she simply felt the need to leave to allow everyone to reflect on what they had done. And not long after, those around her began to realize that she didn't need to be there to make a change. All they needed to do was face themselves. And it was in Brianna's silence that they were forced to do that. That silence spread like a virus through society, making each person confront the deep fear inside them. It wasn't the fear of someone speaking out. It was the fear of realizing that they had ignored everything for so long. They had allowed injustice to exist. They had allowed racism to become a part of daily life without anyone daring to speak out. But Brianna, with her silence, forced them to reassess it all. She didn't need to act, didn't need to call for help. She didn't need to organize a protest or create a movement. She just needed to leave and leave behind a silence full of meaning enough to make everyone wake up. And that's why Brianna wasn't just a victim. She was the winner, victorious in the stillness that others couldn't cope with. When she disappeared, people in the community began to look at each other with different eyes. They felt as though they owed Brianna an apology, an awakening that they had long forgotten. Something strange happened as people began to realize that some things don't need to be spoken for them to be powerful. Sometimes silence is the strongest power because it forces everyone to face the truth they've been avoiding. Brianna didn't need revenge. She didn't need to prove she was right or wrong. She didn't need validation from anyone. She just needed to leave and show the world that no loud fight or grand words were needed. Only one person strong enough to remain silent, and the world would have to change. While Brianna had left, her shadow still lingered everywhere. The system could not stop thinking about her, not because of what she had said or done, but because of her meaningful absence. It was a silence, an absence that everyone could feel, but no one knew how to explain or understand. In an instant, Brianna not only changed her own fate, but also forced an entire system to reassess itself. Brianna didn't need to fight, didn't need to make any declarations to highlight the issues within the system. Her absence changed everything. She made everyone face the truth they had always tried to escape. The system had betrayed itself, creating an unjust structure, and now there was no turning back. Right after Brianna left, internal meetings began to take place in secret spaces. The heads of the relevant agencies, those in power, began to realize that they had created a machine that no longer operated for justice, but merely to protect the power of a select group of people. Even debates over policies, measures of suppression, and violence now seemed meaningless to them, as the oppressed and harmed had never had the chance to speak up. They realized that Brianna's silence wasn't just a physical absence, it was a powerful, undeniable indictment. The people within the system began to ask themselves, how could we have become so blind? How could we stand by and watch so much injustice and discrimination without acting? They began to clearly recognize that all the actions they had taken in the past, from management decisions to protecting those who abused power like Ryan, were not the right ones. This made them question themselves and the values they once thought were inviolable. From the lowest ranks within the police system to the highest leadership positions, everyone began to feel a profound shift in how they viewed justice, morality, and power. Questions that had never been asked before now echoed like an unavoidable wake-up call. Are we really doing the right thing? Are we protecting a system of justice, or just defending the interests of those in power? Intense meetings took place where discussions were no longer just about procedures, but about confronting undeniable truths. Some people in the room began to speak out, sharing stories that had never been heard before about injustice and things they had witnessed over the years. From cases that had been covered up to acts of violence they had seen, but didn't dare speak up about, these things began to come to light. Officers within the police system, from the ordinary staff to high-ranking officers, gradually realized that injustice was not something that could continue to be hidden. They saw that they too were part of the problem, those who had allowed this system to operate without oversight, without any criticism. Some people felt regret for not acting sooner, while others began to realize that they couldn't continue to live in the same negligence and indifference they had before. Throughout these meetings, many began to change their views on power. They realized that real power wasn't about being able to command and control, but about the ability to self-examine, self-criticize, and acknowledge mistakes. Those in positions of power no longer saw power as a tool to maintain order and control, but as a responsibility that needed to be monitored and reconsidered at all times. The system began to show cracks, and the leaders could no longer pretend that everything was fine. They couldn't continue to defend a structure they no longer believed in. The values they once saw as foundational now seemed fragile, no longer strong enough to protect them from questions about the legitimacy of their past actions. But even as all these changes took place, Brianna still didn't appear. She didn't need to come back. She had achieved what she wanted, a shift in the mindset of those in power, an awakening in the community without needing to utter a word. Her absence, her silence became a message more powerful than all the criticisms, more powerful than any struggle. The meetings continued, but now they were no longer discussions about how to maintain power. Instead, they became face-to-face encounters with themselves, confronting what had been allowed to happen and realizing that it could not continue. And throughout this process, Brianna didn't need to do anything more. She simply wasn't there, and by not speaking, everyone had to confront a truth they couldn't deny. Brianna succeeded not because of what she had done, but because of what she didn't do. She didn't need to take action. All she had to do was be there in her silence, and she made everyone stop and reconsider what had happened. Ryan, a police officer who once seemed to have control over everything, was gradually disappearing from society's sight. The things he once saw as power, those respectful glances, the praise from colleagues, had all become distant, unattainable. The feeling of being someone who could influence others, someone who could make a whole community bow before him, was no longer there. He had become a ghost in the very city where he had once been the brightest star. It wasn't because Ryan had done anything wrong that caused people to turn away. It was because Brianna's absence, her silence, had pushed him into a world without sound. Brianna didn't need to speak to fight back. She simply needed to be herself. Someone who had no intention of becoming a symbol, but had unintentionally become something everyone had to face when they thought about power, about injustice. And in that moment, Ryan, with his badge on his shoulder, had become a figure, no longer recognized, no longer respected. As he once was, people no longer saw him as someone with power, but as someone who had been left behind in the storm of questions about truth, justice, and fairness. No one spoke of him anymore. No one mentioned his name. It was as if he had been erased from stories, from meetings, and from discussions about the future. Ryan began to feel that distancing. In meetings, he was no longer invited to participate. The colleagues he once worked alongside now avoided looking him in the eye. Hasty words, averted glances whenever he walked into a room. Ryan felt lost. No one wanted to talk to him. No one wanted to include him in any plans. Everything had changed in ways Ryan couldn't understand. On afternoons when he sat in his patrol car, no one called him over to discuss a case. No one asked for his help. The familiar glances, the waves that once made him feel important, had disappeared. Yes, he could walk through the city, but he was no longer the person people saw. He was no longer the presence they expected. Ryan tried to pull himself together. He couldn't accept this change. He sought recognition in meetings, but instead of being welcomed, he felt the coldness of those around him. A few times he went to the coffee shops he used to frequent to chat with old friends, but now those conversations were gone. The shop owners no longer greeted him with familiar eyes. The staff looked at him without recognizing him. It was a coldness as if he had never existed in their lives. Ryan tried to change how people saw him. He even tried to find ways to restore his image. But the more he did so, the more he felt pushed further away from everyone. He began to realize that there was nothing he could do to regain the power he once had. Once a holder of power, he was now just a ghost, silently moving through the world he once controlled. Every day he became more aware that his existence was slowly fading, contrary to what he had once believed about himself. All the attention now no longer turned toward him. The feeling of insecurity, the feeling that he no longer existed, gradually took over Ryan's heart and mind. He couldn't remember the last time someone spoke to him without avoiding eye contact or words. Nothing existed in his world anymore except silence and the averted glances. People had forgotten him. They no longer needed him. Colleagues, family, even strangers he once thought would remember him, now looked at him like a shadow passing by. They no longer faced him with respect, but with indifference. This only made Ryan feel like he was falling into an endless abyss, a place from which he couldn't escape, where every action he took no longer had meaning. Brianna didn't need to take revenge. She didn't need to speak or do anything to make Ryan realize his mistakes. Her silence did that. And when Ryan felt this change, when he saw that people no longer recognized him, no longer saw him, no longer cared to notice him, that was the moment Ryan knew his power had vanished. The community had changed. They no longer saw him as a person with power, but as someone trying to reclaim the power he had lost. But life couldn't be the same anymore. He couldn't go back, and in that moment, Ryan understood that he was nothing anymore. He had lost everything. not because of a great battle, but simply because a powerful silence had changed everything. Brianna left, and no one asked where she went. She didn't need to say goodbye, didn't leave a note or any trace of her presence. Everything remained inside the hearts of those who had witnessed her silence, and an indelible mark that no one could erase. In a world where actions and words are often seen as the criteria to measure power, Brianna proved that sometimes silence holds more power than anything. She didn't need to do anything more to prove herself. Just existing was enough. While Ryan had once thought that power was something he could control through force, through violent and rigid actions, Brianna proved that true strength doesn't lie in what can be seen or touched. She didn't need to act to create change. Her presence, or rather her absence, caused a silent revolution in the heart of the community. No one could deny the truth that Brianna created a turning point without shedding a drop of sweat or uttering a word. The story of Brianna Cole is not just the story of a strong Black woman. It is the story of invisible power, of how an individual, not through aggression or sharp words, but through her mere presence, can change an entire community. People no longer saw her just as a victim of an unjust attack, but as a symbol of strength that no one could violate and no one could deny. After the punch, after all the scornful looks and debates on social media, Brianna did nothing more. She simply left, leaving everyone around her with a big question in their minds. The question wasn't about her actions, but about her silence. Why could one person make an entire system rethink without speaking? Why could a look, a silence, cause everyone to stop and question themselves? Those who had once looked at her with disdain, those who had judged her by her skin color or her job, could no longer forget that determined gaze. They no longer dared to look at her with contempt because they knew she didn't need to speak or do anything to prove her worth. And thus, Brianna left a mark that no one could erase. As for Ryan, he continued to live in the loneliness and the silence that he had created. The image of Brianna, though she had left, haunted him endlessly. Every time he looked in the mirror, he no longer saw the person he once was. He was no longer a person of power, no longer the one everyone looked at with respect. Brianna's shadow still followed him, not just as memories, but as a presence he could not escape. The community around him had changed. His old friends no longer spoke to him. They didn't openly boycott him, but this unspoken alienation was more evident than any criticism. Ryan felt like he was living in a world where he no longer belonged. Every step he took, every attempt to continue as before, only highlighted the silence and strength that Brianna had left behind. She didn't do anything more than step out of his life, and the world step by step turned its back on him. The story of Brianna Cole, the woman who was not afraid and didn't need to prove anything, became a great lesson for all who witnessed it. She proved that sometimes true power isn't something you hold in your hands, but something you carry in silence. Brianna didn't need to say anything. She just needed to be present, and that is what makes her story unforgettable in the minds of those who witnessed it. Ryan might try to continue his life as before, but those who have seen Brianna, those who have understood the true power of silence, will never return to the old ways. Everything has changed, not by confrontation, not by sharp words, but by a woman who stepped out of the spotlight and allowed the world to reassess itself. So the question remains, is it really necessary to do anything to change everything? Brianna proved that silence, absence, sometimes has more power than action. When you don't need to say anything, when you don't need to do anything more, the world will change simply because of your presence. Brianna has gone, but her story still lives on in the hearts of those who knew her. This story is not just about a conflict between two individuals, but about a system that needs to change. Power is not something that can be measured by violence, but by the ability to change everything without doing anything at all. Brianna has shown us that sometimes just one silent act can overthrow an old system. Silence is not weakness. It is a powerful way to create change. What can't be said in words can be said through actions. And in this story, Brianna did that. She changed everything by standing firm in her silence. Leave a comment with your thoughts after hearing this story. Do you think silence really has the power to change an entire system? And don't forget to share if you feel inspired by the story. Thank you for taking the time to watch, and don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss out on more powerful stories like this. We'll continue bringing you stories that not only move you, but also expand your thinking and change your perspective on life. Join us on this journey.